Hi, I'm Todd Henderson. Today we're going to install the 6.5-inch MaxTrac suspension lift on this 2016 two-wheel drive Tacoma. We're going to do the 4-inch knuckle lift and the 2.5-inch spacer lift in the front, and then we're going to go back to the rear and do a 4-inch block spacer in the back. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, now we're going to have to replace this brake line. So what we're going to do is, a lot of times it's just easier to do that before we get into the full install. So we're going to remove these two clips. We're using a 17mm to hold it in place and a 10mm line wrench to remove the brake line. We're going to have a drip pan to catch any kind of brake fluid. All right. Another good tip is while you're reconnecting your brake lines, you want to reconnect the top portion first so it can go ahead and bleed some brake fluid down into the bottom portion of the brake line. So now what we're going to do is we're going to add a little bit of bend into these clips so they can hold our new brake lines in place. You're always going to have a little bit of brake fluid that hits the frame and the paint on the frame. You want to wipe that up real well. We're going to go ahead and finish tightening up our brake lines using the 17mm and 10mm line wrench. Now we're going to use a 12mm socket to remove the brake line from the factory. This is the brake line bracket we're removing from the factory spindle. We're set it off to the side. All right, we're also going to use a 17mm to remove the caliper. We're going to hang that out of the way. We want to make sure we're not stressing the brake line with the caliper though, so we're going to hang that up along the frame, keep pressure off of the brake line. So now we're going to go ahead and remove the ABS line. First thing we're going to do is use a 10mm to get the ABS line bracket off of the brake line bracket. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to cut the ABS line away from the brake line bracket. We're going to make sure we're very careful not to cut the line itself. We just want to cut the clip that it's attached to. And we're going to bend the bracket out of the way so that the ABS line can break free from that. We're going to hang the caliper out of the way. Make sure you don't put any pressure from the caliper onto that brake line. You want that to hang from the frame with some type of a zip tie or a cable tie of some sort. Now with the caliper free, we can go ahead and pull the rotor out of place and set it to the side. All right, next what we're going to do is you're going to use a 17mm box end wrench. We're going to loosen up the bolts holding the unit bearing in place. We're going to loosen up each one of the bolts. It's important to be able to rotate the hub around where you can get that 17mm box end wrench in on top of the unit bearing bolts. As we loosen them up, you have to loosen them up all at the same time and pull it off all in one piece. And the bolts will still stay held onto the unit bearing. The bolts are captured with the unit bearing, so it's all going to come out together. All right, so now we're going to use a 10mm and remove the ABS line from the spindle. Now we're just going to go ahead and remove the ABS line from the clip that's in the knuckle, so we can move that out of the way. Next, we're going to use a 22mm and remove or loosen the jam nut from the tie rod end. All right, next we're going to go ahead and bend the pin back on the castle nut and pull that free so we can loosen the castle nut off and remove that. All right, now we're going to use a 19mm with a breaker bar and loosen up this castle nut off the tie rod end. Now we're not going to completely pull the castle nut off. We're going to leave a couple of threads on there so it doesn't just drop out when you get it loose. We're going to use a hammer. We're going to bang on the spindle until it pops out. All right, now we're going to go ahead and finish removing the castle nut and bring that tie rod end out. Now we're going to use a screwdriver to pop out the top cotter pin. This is for the ball joint at the top of the spindle. Next, we're going to use a 17 millimeter to remove the sway bar end link from the factory spindle. Now you notice that sway bar just dropped right down. That's because we've already done the same thing on the opposite side. Now we're going to use a 19 millimeter to loosen the castle nut from the ball joint up at the top of the spindle. We're going to pull the threads part of the way down so we can bang that loose just like the last one. Now we're going to use a hammer, hit this part of the spindle, and it'll break loose from the ball joint. All right, so we still have some pressure up on the upper ball joint. So before we completely remove that, we're going to go down to the lower ball joint steering stop plate, remove the two 19 millimeters that hold that in place. They're going to pop loose. Now we can go ahead and finish removing that castle nut and pull this, the spindle out of the way. Now we're removing the skid plate to access the lower control arm bolts. It's got to go towards you and down. There you go. So next what we need to do is we need to loosen up the lower control arm bolts using a 19 millimeter. We'll do that here and over here. But before we do that, we need to go ahead and mark where it is for a good reference. So in case it comes out of place, we can put it back where it was. I'm using a silver Sharpie. Now we're going to go ahead and use a 22 millimeter wrench to loosen up the lower control arm bolts. Now we're going to use two 19 millimeters, a wrench in a socket. We'll remove the bolt that holds the shock to the lower control arm. So now we're going to remove the three nuts that hold the strut in place with a 14 millimeter. Now we can go ahead and lower the strut out from underneath the truck. All right, so now we've got our strut in a vise to hold it still so we can tighten everything down onto it. We're going to use some blue Loctite and put it on the factory studs that come out of the top of the strut. Next, we're going to take our spacer, set it in place, and put our 14 millimeter factory hardware back over top of those studs. Now we're going to go ahead and tighten those down to factory spec. All right, now with this still in place, we're going to go ahead and put Loctite on the new studs coming out of the spacer. All right, now the way it came out, we're going to have to turn it 180 degrees for it to go back in. We can set it back in place and set the new 14 millimeter hardware onto the studs to hold the strut in place. We're going to leave them loose for right now. All right, now we're going to use some blue Loctite. This is on the lower control arm where the factory bolt goes back into the factory shock. We're going to go ahead and set that in place. All right, we're going to use two 19 millimeters to tighten it back down. All right, now we're going to go ahead and use a 14 millimeter and tighten down the top. support the rear before you start lifting up this lower control arm. Now we're going to go ahead and use the supplied hardware with a kit to install the new knuckle to lower ball joint steering stop. We already applied thread lock to new hardware. Now we're going to go ahead and tighten this new spindle to the lower ball joint steering stop. Now with everything properly supported so that we don't die, we're going to go ahead and jack up the lower control arm so where we can lower the upper control arm down into the new spindle. We're going to reattach it with the factory castle nut. Now we're going to use a 19 millimeter and tighten down the upper control arm to the castle nut. Now we're going to go ahead and put the tie rod end from the factory into the new spindle and attach it with the factory castle nut. All right, tightening that down with a 19 millimeter. Okay, now we want to line up the gap in the castle nut to the hole in the stud. Do this in all of our castle nuts. That way we can put the pin back in. And we want to tighten to the hole, don't get it past, then loosen back to the hole. Now we're going to go ahead and reattach the sway bar end link into the new steering spindle. Now we're going to reattach the unit bearing, but we're going to put some Loctite on the studs before we put them in. There again, these bolts are captured inside that unit bearing, so you want to get all the bolts started before you can tighten them down. Next, we're going to use a 17 millimeter wrench to tighten down the unit bearing bolts. Now we're going to put the factory rotor back in place and we'll hold it on with a couple of lug nuts. So next what we need to do is pin the tab straight on the brake line bracket so it can fasten in place properly. Now we're going to use our 17 millimeter and reattach our caliper. All right, so we took the clip out of the brake line bracket so we can move it around. What we're going to do is we're actually move that hard line a little bit, bend it around to where we can fit our factory or our bolt through the spindle, and we're using 7/16 hardware to tighten that down. Once we get that in place, then we'll put our clip back in place. All right, now we're going to remove the bracket that holds the ABS line. We need to stretch that ABS line to reattach the spindle in the proper position. We're going to take the 10 millimeter bolt out from on top of the strut tower so we can free up the ABS line. Next, we're going to go ahead and free the ABS line from the ABS line bracket by bending the bracket and wiggling it out. That's going to allow us to stretch our ABS line further down to attach it to the spindle. All right, next we're going to go ahead and attach our ABS sensor to the bottom of the spindle and use a 10 millimeter to fasten it in with factory hardware. Now that we're full droop, we're going to go ahead and zip tie the ABS line to the brake line. We're going to do that in about 3 locations. Now we're going to go ahead and reinstall our clips in our upper control arm, the ball joint, and also in the tie rod end. Now we're going to go ahead and line it up and retighten our lower control arm bolts using a 22 millimeter. All right, next we're going to use a 22 millimeter to tighten down the jam nut on the tie rod end. All right, next we're going to go ahead and reinstall the skid plate. Okay, now we've got the front of the truck wrapped up. Let's go ahead and move to the back. So I went ahead and bent down the ABS bracket to get a little bit more play in the ABS lines. We're going to go ahead and start to droop the axle. We're going to release this bracket right here for the brake lines. And as we droop the axle, we're going to see where we start getting tension. Up here is 12 millimeter hardware to remove that. We're using 17 millimeter hardware to remove the shock from the axle. We're using 17 millimeter to remove the factory shock from the axle. All right, if you don't have any help pulling this bolt out, what you're going to want to do is just pull it out with a ratchet or ratcheting wrench. You never want to beat on the end of that bolt to get that out of there. You don't want to mess with those threads because you have to reuse that bolt. All right, now we're using a 14 millimeter to undo the nut on the top of the shock, and also a vice grip to hold the stud on the shock still to get that off of there. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to support the axle with a jack, and we're going to move the U-bolt with a 19 millimeter. We're just going to do one side at a time. All right, now our emergency brake line is getting real tight against this bracket, so what we're going to do is we're going to remove that bracket with a 12 millimeter. Now this next bracket is getting really tight on our e-brake cable, so we're going to remove that with a 12 millimeter as well. All right, so now we got our spacer block. You're going to notice you got two holes in the top. The center hole is for your Toyota applications. Your offset hole is for Chevy and GM applications. This is going to be pitched down towards the front. So what we're going to do is we're going to set that in place and drop the pin down into the hole in the frame. And then we're going to slowly raise this back up to meet the peg that comes out of the leaf springs. Now, this is not going to be lining up to the holes properly, so what we're going to do is we're going to loosen up the universal bolts on the opposite side, not completely take them out, but loosen them up a little bit, where we can move this around, line everything up, and lift our jack up and tighten it down. All right, now we got the U-bolts in place. We're going to set them, make sure they go back behind your brake lines, then put our factory plate back through the U-bolt and attach the new hardware. All right, we went ahead and removed our brake line brackets from this side because we knew we were going to have to do it. We're going to go ahead and remove the universal bolts on this side as well. Just repeat the exact same process. Now that we have the U-bolts in place, we need to cut them down so we can get the deep well socket on it. Now we're going to tighten down our U-bolts with a 22 millimeter. Now we're going to go ahead and tighten down the U-bolts to 100 foot-pounds. Okay, so now we've got the rear shock. On our application, we can't use the bushing that's already in there, so we're going to have to press that out. So we have a bunch of different sockets so we can press this out. Then we're going to press in this slightly shorter bushing Okay, so this is our shock end. What we're going to do, we need to make sure we have a washer on here, then a bushing, and then this goes up into the frame. And once it goes through, then this piece goes in. What you're going to notice, you've got a lip on this side and a lip on that side. Those two lips need to be facing each other. So this goes up through, then this goes on top, followed by the nut, and you can tighten it down. Go ahead and put on our hardware to hold the shock to the axle. I'm going to tighten that down with 17 millimeter. Right now for our emergency brake brackets, we're going to have some extensions. We're going to take our factory hardware and go through this bracket, and this bracket is going to kick out to keep everything away from our leaf spring. And you got the notch that's going to be facing towards the back of the vehicle. We're going to take our factory bolt, put it in there finger tight. We're going to bring our bracket up. It's going to rest inside that notch. And what we're going to do is we're going to use our supplied hardware. It's going to go in through the back and come out the front. That way we have less to try to hit the spring with. Then we're going to slide our washer on top, and we've got a serrated flange nut. It's going to go on top of that. This gets tightened down with a 12 millimeter. And down here we're going to use 13 millimeter to tighten down this hardware. Okay, now the next bracket back goes to the leaf spring. We're going to use the factory hardware to go back into the threads there. We'll run our bolt down through, put on a washer, and then also a serrated flange nut. Again, factory hardware tightens down with a 12 millimeter. New hardware is going to tighten down with a 13 millimeter. Repeat the same process on the opposite side. All right, now this brake line bracket, we had a factory bolt that came out of here. We're going to reuse that factory bolt with this bracket. This is going to splay this apart. Factory bolt's going to go down through here and thread right back into the frame, or that bracket that's on the axle. Next, we're going to use new hardware to go down through the top side of the bracket. We're going to use a flat washer and a serrated flange nut. Factory hardware tightens down with a 12 millimeter. Hardware tightens down with a 13 millimeter. Now this brake line tab that we released before, we're going to reattach. We're going to use the 12 millimeter hardware that came out of it and tighten that down. All right, now we're going to use a 17 millimeter, and we're going to hold that tight with a 5.5 millimeter wrench up at the top. We're going to do this on both sides as well. Okay, so we're done with the back. Next thing we're going to do is come up to the front and bleed the brakes. Once we're all done, it's a great chance to go ahead and slow down, double check everything, make sure all your bolts are tightened to factory spec, check your brake lines, make sure nothing is in the way, and then we're going to want to take this directly to an alignment shop and get it aligned. In about 500 miles, we're going to go back and double check all our bolts, make sure everything's working right, nothing's binding anywhere, and that concludes the installation. If you have any questions, call the experts. We're here to help you pick the right parts for you.